In this video, I'm going to go through how you can get your top marks in a question on loneliness in Of Mice and Men for Edexcel, IGCSE English Literature. So, first of all, let's look at the mark scheme. What are you being assessed on? So, AO1, demonstrate a close knowledge and understanding of text, maintaining a critical style, presenting an informed personal engagement for 20 marks. What does this mean? So first of all, you must have a close knowledge of the text. This means that you can't just have read it once, you need to know the detail and be able to pick up on the nuances. You need to have a critical style. That means you need to be able to think about things from different angles, not just say the obvious answer. And you need to present an informed personal engagement. That means you need to have an argument. You need to be able to explain what was John Steinbeck trying to say about 1930s American society. Which links to AO4. So AO4, you need to show understanding of the relationships between texts and the context in which they were written. Now this is also 20 marks. It's not enough to just put in context. You need to be able to specifically link it to your argument. So the whole way through, I want you to be thinking, what is John Steinbeck trying to say about 1930s America? And if you keep that in mind in your essay, you're going to be automatically starting to hit AO1 and AO4. Okay, so what is John Steinbeck trying to say about society? Let's really dig deep into context. So first of all, in 1929, there was the Wall Street crash, which led to the Great Depression. During this time, up to 29% of Americans were unemployed. So there were huge long lines at soup kitchens, many people were homeless, and obviously people were desperate for jobs, so people were fighting over jobs. So this is not a society where people are supported if they're in difficult situations. So if we think about a character like Candy worries about what will happen to him when he's old and alone, because actually people in society are struggling. There's not going to be people who are going to find it easy to take him in. The Dust Bowl, so when many of the southern plains in America got very dried up and these huge dust storms were created, it meant that there were so many migrant workers who would go from farm to farm to farm trying to get work. So some of these migrant workers would have owned their own farms previously, but because of the Dust Bowl, they would have had to sell up if they could get any money, and then they'd have to go work for other people. So this means they don't have roots, they don't have their own home. They're having to go from farm to farm, wherever the work is. So think about how that would contribute to a feeling of loneliness within society. Also, the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, were a great time for women because a lot of progress was made of them working towards their independence. More of them were able to get jobs. It was a time of flapper dresses and dancing and jazz music. Then the 1930s, and actually when people were made unemployed, it was much more likely to be a woman than a man. They would let the women go before the men. So women, if you think about their kind of social role, they'd had much more independence and freedom, and then 1930s they're pushed back into the home and they have to be homemakers. So that's very relevant for thinking about Curley's wife, and she wishes she could have gone to Hollywood or been in the pictures, and instead she's on this ranch with a load of men who don't talk to her. So think about how that would contribute to loneliness. And then lastly, obviously racism. We've got this very lonely character of Crooks. So there were the Jim Crow laws, which were in force in California. And in the Constitution of America, it is said that all Americans had equal rights. However, that was not what the case was in practice. So the Jim Crow laws kept black people and white people separate, but of course the white people got treated better. So if we think about Crooks and how he's in the stables, he's literally segregated from all the migrant workers, other migrant workers who are in the bunkhouse. There's that segregation there, and obviously that links to loneliness as well. So there is so much that you can link to context here, and remember you must be doing that throughout to get those top marks. So George and Lenny. Now George and Lenny are a bit of a counterpoint to loneliness because they have each other, they have that companionship. But George says at the beginning, the very beginning when they're in the brush, guys like us that work on ranches are the loneliest guys in the world. They got no family, they don't belong no place. We've got this superlative statement, the loneliest guys in the world. So what is John Steinbeck trying to say there about the lives of migrant workers? He himself worked on a ranch as well, so he saw other workers. So this is coming from real experience for John Steinbeck. But George and Lenny know they're different. So George went on, with us it ain't like that. We got a future, We got somebody to talk to that gives a damn about us. Lenny broke in. But not us, and why? Because I got you to look after me and you got me to look after you. And that's why. And it's interesting that Lenny says look after, because obviously George has to look after Lenny, that kind of parent-child relationship. But George and Lenny know they're different. They know that even George knows, however annoying Lenny is, actually he's lucky to have somebody that gives a damn about him, which makes it even more desperately sad at the end when George is alone and he loses Lenny, because actually George has become just like all the other ranch men, and that now he's alone. He doesn't have anyone that particularly cares about him. Candy, obviously a very sad character in Of Mice and Men. At the beginning, he's not lonely in the sense that he has his dog. So he says, well, hell, I had him so long. Had him since he was a pup. I herded sheep with him. It's interesting that they herded sheep together. So when they were of value to the farm, you know, the dog herded sheep, Candy had both hands and he was able to work, they were valuable. Now Candy's getting old and isn't able to work and the dog can't work. That's when Carlson suggests, let's kill the dog. So think about what John Steinbeck might be saying about capitalism and of people are only valuable if they contribute something to society. And actually people like Candy who, you know, when they're old and vulnerable need caring for, those systems don't exist to care for him. So think about how that would contribute to loneliness as well. This is when Curly's wife has died and Candy is beginning to realise that if Lenny's killed Curly's wife, perhaps their dream isn't going to happen. Candy spoke his greatest fear. You and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice, can't we, George? Can't we? Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down at the hay. He knew. So we've got this pleading tone here where Candy is repeating all these questions. Can't we, George? Can't we? Can't we? So we see this kind of desperate sadness here from Candy through these repeated questions. And he knows it's not going to happen. And the final image we're left with of Candy is he kind of falls in the hay and he puts his arms over his eyes. So again, he's alone in the hay. He's by himself. So Candy, you could definitely write a very good paragraph about how he links to loneliness. Crooks, obviously we've talked about the racism within 1930s America. He is also destined to be alone. And scattered about the floor were a number of personal possessions. For being alone, Crooks could leave his things about. So John Steinbeck makes his isolation very clear from the very beginning, because in his very first description of Crooks, he talks about him being alone. And it's interesting in terms of structure, in the chapter where Lenny comes to talk to Crooks in the stables, Crooks very slowly begins to warm up and enjoy having first Lenny and then Candy around. And he begins to feel like this is nice to be able to talk to people. He says to Lenny, you know, a guy needs to talk sometimes. A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody to talk to. But then Curly's wife arrives, and when he doesn't do immediately what she wants, she says, you keep your place then. I could get you strung up on a tree so easy, it ain't even funny. So she immediately reminds Crooks of what she perceives as his place in society. She asserts her power as a white woman over him, and then Crooks reduced himself to nothing. So obviously there's a lot you could write there about the racism. You could link it to the KKK, and you know the lynchings they did. And actually, if a white woman, if she said to somebody that Crooks had attacked her, they wouldn't do a trial. They wouldn't necessarily ask questions. The KKK would lynch Crooks. So the violence there in terms of how he is isolated by Curly's wife is something that you could explore absolutely in an essay. And then Curly's wife, she says to Lenny, I get lonely, you can talk to people, but I can't talk to nobody but Curly, else he gets mad. How do you like not to talk to anybody? So Curly's wife, if we think about, you know, she had been a young girl, she'd been going to dances, she wanted to go to Hollywood, and then she got annoyed with her mother and she married Curly. Now she's on a ranch where she can't talk to anyone but Curly. And as we know, Curly's not the nicest guy, is he? Her isolation is really emphasised. I think as well, John Steinbeck raises the sexism within society, linking it to the loneliness, because obviously we see Curly's wife is called jailbait, rat trap, all these horrible names, and the men assume that she's trying to flirt with them. But then when she says this to Lenny, perhaps John Steinbeck makes us question, actually, was she ever trying to flirt, or did she just want to talk to someone? She's just lonely. So John Steinbeck makes us question, actually the perceptions of Curley's wife, and were they influenced by sexism, and is that contributing to her loneliness? So obviously you could link that to the context of sexism within 1930s America. Other things worth noting about isolation. First of all, soledad, the setting, means loneliness in Spanish. So that's, I think, John Steinbeck's way of saying this is a major theme of the novel, but also it's an all-encompassing theme. Almost all of the characters are lonely. The men play solitaire. Now, solitaire is a game that you often play alone. So it's interesting that actually the men have each other, and sometimes they do play cards, but even so, they often play solitaire, a solo game. So it's like that idea that they're together, but they're all isolated from each other because they don't have these roots because of, their migrant worker past, or because of racism or sexism, etc. And then even when George and Lenny are introduced, the first time we see them, they're walking in single file down the path. So they're not together. Lenny is following George. And obviously that introduces the kind of parent-child relationship between George and Lenny. But also, I think it just shows that they are in a single journey, each of them. And actually they're not together. And it kind of, I think, links to George being alone at the end. So just a reminder, very clear what you're assessed on. You need to have that informed personal engagement, critical style, and you need to know the text very well. But very important, half the marks are for showing the relationship between text and the context.